Lately, I've been wondering, what are orcs exactly? They seem to have changed quite a bit in games and RPG culture over the past decade or two, but I'm always curious to dig into fantasy creatures to find out how they originated and how they've evolved over time. Before we go down this orcish rabbit hole, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. My big goal is to spread inspiration and creative ideas, so your support here on YouTube really helps to keep me motivated. As we know, orcs are a fictional race of humanoids that are typically depicted as brutal, aggressive, and warlike in fantasy, both in the literature and in games. They're often depicted as being of lower intelligence and having a strong inclination towards violence and destruction. They are commonly portrayed as enemies of humans and other good races in fantasy stories and in games. Orcs originated in fantasy literature, and they have been a staple of fantasy fiction for actually centuries. They were first popularized by J.R.R. Tolkien in his Middle-earth Legendarium, where they were portrayed as a monstrous race of humanoids that were created by the Dark Lord Morgoth, then later on controlled by Sauron. They are a prominent feature in his novels, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Actually, the term goblin gets used quite a bit in there too, but we'll get to that here in just a few minutes. So, since Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, orcs have been featured in a wide variety of fantasy fiction, novels, games, films, etc. They have become a common archetype in fantasy, and they have been adapted and reinterpreted by many different authors and game designers in various forms. Tolkien himself said that he was influenced by Beowulf, the Old English epic poem, when he created orcs. In Beowulf, the word orc is actually only used one time, and technically it's in its plural form, orcneus. Its exact meaning in Beowulf is not really clear. It might refer to something like a sea monster. It might be something like the giants that dwell in swamps, such as Grendel and his mother. Or it might mean monsters that come from the underworld, such as evil spirits or maybe even undead. So it seems to be a non-specific, generalized monster term, and whichever interpretation we go with, the term lacks the characteristics and the depth of the orcs in Tolkien's works. In the 10th century Old English glossary called Cleopatra Glossaries, the word orc is translated from the Latin orcus, which refers to the underworld and death, and is even associated with the god Pluto, who's similar to Hades in Greek mythology. We also see here where Dungeons & Dragons gets the name Orcus for the demon lord of undeath. And by the way, I deemed him the most evil demon in D&D in my previous video about the most evil demons in Dungeons & Dragons. So in the Cleopatra glossaries, orc is defined as a goblin, a specter, or a hell devil. In other words, it's a type of monster or fiend. It's not a humanoid-like race. These monsters are typically associated with death and destruction and are often portrayed as fierce and terrifying creatures. The word orc develops further over the centuries, and by the time it's the Renaissance and the early modern periods, it's intermingled with the term ogre. Folk tales and fairy tales from all across Europe speak of brutish, semi-humanoid creatures, something like a giant, sometimes maybe more like a demon. They live in wild or dark places, and they eat people. It is Tolkien who created the modern orc as we know it, as he essentially created the entire modern fantasy genre as we know it. He took creatures from earlier myths and fairy tales and he made them more realistic. Just look at elves and dwarves. Those are originally fairies, and I mean fairies in the traditional sense of the word, not the Disney cartoon pixie sense. So elves and dwarves originally are spirits. They're more akin to angels, demons, or jinn. So Tolkien took spirits and fleshed them out. He reconceptualized them as races in a world. His work has had a tremendous impact on Dungeons & Dragons, which was the first role-playing game, and D&D thus birthed the RPG gaming genre. Orcs in D&D, much like in Tolkien's mythos, were conceptualized as savage, monstrous reavers that were created by an evil god. Gruumsh in the case of D&D, sort of like what Morgoth did in Middle-earth. Tolkien's orcs were created as a mockery of elves and men. They are described as being smaller and weaker than men, but stronger and more agile than dwarves. This might surprise you, as nowadays we always think of orcs as being actually a little bigger and stronger than humans. But we have to remember that to Tolkien, orc and goblin are essentially the same thing. In The Hobbit, it is stated, orc is not an English word. It occurs in one or two places, but it's usually translated goblin. In Middle-earth, orcs tended to live in caves or other dark places, and they disliked sunlight. However, there were also the Uruk-hai, which were bred in the Third Age, and they were bigger, stronger, and unfazed by daylight. So super orcs, we could maybe think. The orcs of Middle-earth are typically depicted as being of lower intelligence and having a strong inclination towards violence and destruction. They have a cruel and sadistic temperament, and they enjoy causing pain and suffering to others. They are also portrayed as being fiercely loyal to their masters, and they will obey orders without question. So in Tolkien's world, orcs are lawful evil, which is quite different from the chaotic evil orcs of modern D&D. The orcs have crooked frames and bow-legged gaits. Their skin can have various shades of dull yellows, greens, browns, and even blacks. It's described as sallow skin, so it has an unhealthy complexion to it. The Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films did an excellent job portraying all these characteristics of orcs. So Tolkien had a huge impact on D&D, and D&D thus had a huge impact on video games. The massively successful games Warcraft and World of Warcraft featured orcs as one of the main races. In these games, orcs receive an even more simplified appearance, all green-skinned. It's also reminiscent of the Games Workshop orcs like from Warhammer and HeroQuest. An important change brought about by World of Warcraft is that the game also made orcs more human-like, instead of being exclusively a kind of monstrous enemy. They are one of the main playable character races. They're still known for brute strength and for endurance and ferocity in battle, but in WoW, they are a proud, honorable race. A warrior race, and the founders of the Horde, yes, but a kind of noble race at their core. They have a rich cultural heritage with a deep reverence for their ancestors and for nature. They are also shown as having a strong sense of community and loyalty to their clan and tribe. There is still a connection to the demonic or kind of evil origin, as they were originally enslaved by the Burning Legion, a powerful group of demons, but they were freed by the Horde's founder, Thrall, who became their leader and war chief. They went on to become a powerful and respected force in the Horde, and they've played a prominent role in many of the game's storylines and expansions. Due to WoW's success, it influenced many other games, including D&D, so the influence cycled back, we could say. But this complicates things. Orcs were always enemy monsters in D&D. But should they actually be a player character race? The classic solution to this conundrum was the half-orc, a mixed parentage race that is part orc and part human. It allowed players to essentially enjoy playing an orc while also being pretty solidly aligned with the races associated with the heroes, the good guys. However, for many years now, there has been a trend in D&D to see orcs less as monsters spawned by evil and more as a player character race deserving of respect. Is this a good thing? That is the question that I keep pondering. It certainly causes friction between players on the two sides of the issue. On the one side, which is the old school view, it holds that in D&D, orcs are brutal creatures that inhabit dark, subterranean places. They're savage, they often work for powerful, evil beings like demons or dragons. This portrayal of orcs as monsters is consistent with their classic role in fantasy literature and games. Allowing orcs to be played as a player character race would go against the established lore and tradition of orcs. It would also create a disconnect between the players and the orcs they may encounter as monsters in the game. Players might find it difficult to take orcs as a serious threat if they can also just choose to play as one. Furthermore, orcs in D&D often lack the complexity and the depth of other races. They're often portrayed as one-dimensional, aggressive brutes, which may not be appealing to many players. This lack of complexity and depth makes it difficult to create an interesting and compelling character when you're playing as an orc. On the other side of the issue is the new school view. It believes that orcs' portrayal as monstrous warmongers is not the only one. That's not the only way to go. It shouldn't limit the potential of orcs as a race in D&D. Allowing orcs to be played as a player character race would offer players a wider range of options when creating their characters. It would also add in that depth and complexity to the orcs as a race in D&D. By playing as an orc, the players thus would explore the cultural and societal aspects of the race, rather than just focusing on their aggressive nature. This would allow players to create unique and interesting characters that challenge stereotypes and preconceived notions about orcs. This perspective holds that orcs in D&D can be portrayed as more than just simple-minded brutes. They can be shown to have motivations, beliefs, even morals. This would make them more relatable and believable as characters. It would allow players to identify with them on a deeper level. Additionally, orcs as a player character race would also add more diversity to the game and promote inclusivity. It would allow players who identify with orcs or who want to experience playing as an orc to do so. Allowing orcs to be played as player characters would also offer new role-playing opportunities. For example, a player could role-play an orc who broke away from the traditional orc society, who is trying to find a new place in the world, or maybe one who is fighting against the prejudices or preconceived notions of other races. You might ask here, but Esper, my dear bardic companion, what is your opinion on this topic? Which of those two perspectives do you hold? Well, let me try to answer this. In general, I do gravitate toward tradition because tradition has the deeper roots. It has the development of centuries. It has the stories that have shaped our world. It often has more soulfulness, more humanness, and more grit. That said, I don't think that just because something is tradition, it is necessarily the best way. In some cases, it's the way that functioned best for a given place and time, but now has become outdated or restrictive. And, overall, we do need innovation. We need fresh ideas. So tradition might be my sort of initial step or my default go-to. but it does not automatically win in all cases. So, what does win? What is best? I would say the best story is what wins. If someone can create a setting in which orcs are a player character race, maybe somewhat more brutish, but not evil overall, and the setting has great lore and world building surrounding said orcs, then I say awesome. Let's check it out. A setting could have orcs as a more noble player character race, or it also could have them as monsters spawned by an evil god. As long as it's done well, that's really what's most important. And by done well, I mean things like great writing, interesting story hooks, compelling characters, and substantial and artistic aesthetics. So, what are orcs? What is an orc? They began as evil underworld spirits or giant sea monsters, then turned into fairy tale ogres, then became a hateful, monstrous race in Middle-earth created by Morgoth. Then they found a place as monsters in D&D. Then they became green-skinned player characters in games like World of Warcraft and The Elder Scrolls, which in turn influenced them in late-stage 5th edition D&D. At a certain point, though, I do have to ask, are they even truly orcs anymore? Or are they just humans with green skin and little tusks? I can't tell you how many pieces of art I've seen online in which the orc was just a green anime person. I would never want to discourage anybody from drawing, but I much prefer an orc to be like this. I just find it more interesting. I find it stronger. It also has a bit more connection to the history of the orc as a creature. That's a good thing, I think, because being disconnected from history is dangerous in a variety of ways. If you are someone who has long been interested in playing a more monstrous option in D&D, make sure to check out my Kickstarter for Monstrous Heroes. It is a 5e book that has lots of options for characters that are beyond the scope of typical humanoids. Things like minotaurs, spider people, ogres, vampires, even dragons. It provides a different solution to the issue I discussed in this video. Instead of trying to make monsters fit into the mold of humanoids, it gives you options to play actual monsters. This is done by turning monsters into classes. As of recording this in January 2023, the Kickstarter is in pre-launch, and you will be able to back it just starting next month. So see the link down in the video description for the pre-launch page and to grab a copy of the preview of Monstrous Heroes. This is Esper. I'm wishing you the best for your grappling with monsters of all kinds, and as always, may your adventures be many.